Hey there, everybody. So I'm making a quick impromptu video because I realize this is actually a gap in the discussion of Guattari studies that I think I need to, address in some way. I've been wanting to make a video about the psychiatry that surrounds Felix Guattari, right? But I just, haven't gotten around to it for one reason or another, and it's really frustrating because I really want to talk about, how the schizophrenic is situated in the discourse of Guattari, because I think it's not easy to understand that by just flipping through the books and just, reading here and there, trying to find, case studies, things like that, just kind of giving a surface level value. That's not going to, be apparent. And part of the issue, I think, is essentially what historical accounts are available in English and potentially even French are quite limited on the clinical side of what he was doing. And I think that's a really important question to ask, because he was working as a psychoanalyst slash psychotherapist at Borde for over 35 years, I believe. Was it 35 years? Well, actually, it was 20. No, he worked there for 35 years. He was a therapist for 20 years because he was training under Lacan in the 60s. So, but he was still working at Borde, and he was still actively working with, patients. He was just being guided by, a trained psychiatrist in Jean Uri, right? And the thing is that, what's really frustrating about, what currently exists of Deleuze and Guattari studies, and something that outsiders probably don't understand about the field, right, is first off, Guattari has kind of had to struggle to even be able to have, a presence in his discourse, in the discourse surrounding Deleuze, right? Because for the longest time, people kind of looked at books like Anti-Oedipus and A Thousand Plateaus as Deleuze's work, where he was consulting that, wacky, crazy psychoanalyst. But it turns out over time, the researchers and the academics who were particularly interested in analyzing this literature realized that there was more to the picture. There was more to Guattari. So they started to analyze, his texts that were translated, right? And they started to even translate, more texts. In fact, starting around, I would say, 2007, 2008, there is a noticeable increase in interest in specifically Guattari, with more and more publications coming out. And so, the field of Deleuze studies has transitioned towards Deleuze and Guattari studies, right? Because you can't really just forget about him, because he had a lot of influence. Now, where I am positioned, and, to some extent I would personally argue someone like Schizoanalytic Onion, who is involved in the research, more directly than I am. I'm more like an entertainer. I want to be more involved in the research, but I just don't have the academic background currently. I'm trying to see if I can actually get into school, but we'll see. That might be actually a possibility to figure out my situation. But going back to what I was saying, basically, Guattari himself is not usually, analyzed by himself, and usually when he is, he's compared to Deleuze. Now, there, again, has been a growing academic movement to actually change that. Figures just on the top of my head, I know that Gary Gnosco and Ian Buchanan have written stuff about specifically Guattari, right? But, that's kind of contained within an academic sphere. And the problem here now is that, well, what kind of person was Guattari in life? Well, Guattari was basically a pretty aggressive activist, actually. He was very heavily involved on the ground in leftist movements throughout his whole life. And he also did a lot of, crazy shit with, media and technology and arts and all sorts of stuff. He was not really an academic. He was more like a crazy therapist who had a lot of extracurricular activities, to put it lightly. So, because of that, again, Guattari in his life was a lot of the time reaching people who were, maybe students, but mostly people who were, not in academia. He wasn't really an academic. He wasn't like trying to confine himself to that kind of discourse. And because of that, I think it's important to kind of like explore what parts of Guattari's history are we not seeing because we analyzed it through this lens of him being a philosopher for so long. And I think a big part of it is that we have neglected his history with psychotherapy, right? And this is understandable because the literature on Guattari's actual work that he did for over 20 years at Borde, right, is just, there's not a lot on it. Like, there is Francois Dawes's account in Intersecting Lives, but I do want to discuss why Intersecting Lives may not be the best resource for, you know, actually understanding what happened there and things like that, right? So first, I want to talk a little bit about the translation history of Guattari, right? So right here is Molecular Revolution, and this is very interesting publication in terms of Guattari's translation history, because it's probably the only major publication of Guattari by himself that was published in English in his lifetime. There may have been some, like, right at the tail end of his lifetime that I don't know about on the top of my head. Maybe some, like, random printing of 3 ecologies, I don't know. But most of his publications in English came after his death. But this was very different. Now we can see that David Cooper was involved with the publication of this book. Now, if you don't know who David Cooper is part of what most people would call the Anglo anti-psychiatry movement. Now, you might be like, well, why is Guattari working with anti-psychiatry? Isn't anti-psychiatry a bunch of pseudoscience, right? Now, I personally agree that the discourse of anti-psychiatry has a lot of problems, but I also believe that the discourse surrounding why anti-psychiatry has a lot of problems is highly flawed, right? And is largely directed by people who don't understand why a schizophrenic would actually be interested in anti-psychiatry in the first place. And hint, hint, it's not just about meds, okay? It's not about big pharma. It's not about paranoia. What it's really about is political enfranchisement, right? So I want you, for a second, to imagine that you are medicated and then and you kind of like pull yourself together for the first time in 18 months. And you realize that for the last 18 months, you have been in an insane, indescribable fantasy that disconnected you from reality. And this is the first time that you've ever stabilized enough to understand what's going on around you. Like, I want you to put yourself in those shoes, right? Now, I want you to go and think about what happens when you search online about, like, how to, you know, deal with this phenomenon, right? And what you're gonna find is that people are miserable, right? Psych support communities are some of the most fucking miserable places on the internet, especially for psychosis. There's so many people who want themselves dead. There's so many people who hate their lives or say that they don't want to have children because they don't want to, you know, have their children inherit this horrible disease. And you read that and you're just like, well, where do I go from here? What do I do with that, right? Because there's no political enfranchisement in shut the fuck up, take your meds, and get back to work. All right? And I think that's something that people who work in the field really need to get through to their heads, right? That doesn't solve the existential problems that caused all of this to happen in the first place. And yes, some of that existential problem is some kind of glitch in the in the brain chemistry and the structure of the neurons and some other genetic, you know, relations or whatever. It's not my fucking, you know, it's not my fucking field. I don't know everything about it, right? But there's also this element of political disenfranchisement, where you suddenly realize that people are not going to listen to you anymore, they're not going to take you seriously anymore, and you're going to have to fight 10 times harder just to be heard, because half the time you don't even know if you're making any sense or not, right? And that's really hard. That's really hard. And what happens is that these politically disenfranchised people, who may or may not be familiar with the literature on psychosis, right, will read this stuff, right? And they might be able to construct some kind of like ass backwards opinion about how their schizophrenia works, and that can be dangerous, right? Now, I think the thing that is important about this to understand, though, right, is and why we should be talking about anti-psychiatry, right, is because anti-psychiatry did not serve the same purpose as, say, something like those fake cancer treatments in Mexico that cost like $4,000 a treatment that don't do anything, right? There's a big difference between those two, right? And the difference is that anti-psychiatry wasn't trying to scam people out of money. Like Kingsley Hall, which is what R.D. Lang did. I can't remember what city, but he basically had rented out a place, and he had like his little schizo experiment in there, right? Where he had, he had a couple of subjects who wanted to work with him in an experimental living situation, which was a shit show, by the way. A major shit show. And it's funny because Guattari literally has a whole thing on why it's a shit show, right? But yeah, so basically, the question shouldn't be like, okay, these guys are the bad guys because they're not scientific, right? The question should be, why were they wrong? And what can we learn about them, right? Because one of the biggest problems, I think, like being somebody who's diagnosed with a psychotic disorder, is that you're not given any tools for hope. And what gave me hope, and the reason why I'm into Guattari is not because I think he's like right about everything. In fact, I don't agree with him on everything, and there's a lot of things in his life that he did that are definitely not okay and not good, right? Like, like the whole cheating on his wife thing, like, yikes, right? And like, like he has good takes on a lot of things, especially things that, are regarding like trans people, sex workers, that kind of thing, right? But he's not right all the time, right? I like his approach, I like his view, but really what got me into him, right, was understanding when I was going crazy, right? Now, mind you, I did understand a little bit about psychosis when I was going crazy because I had read as a child an introduction to psychology book that included a section that went into quite a bit of detail for an introductory book about the nature of, schizophrenia, right? And from a young age, I was aware of the presence of schizophrenia, but at the same time, I had not experienced it directly personally outside of, like, fully medicated conditions, right? I had not experienced, like, an episode in front of me, right? So I was aware of things that maybe I should look out for, because I was very paranoid about being schizophrenic, because of a lot of things. I don't want to go into too much detail about it, but yeah, so, like, when I went crazy, right, I was aware sometimes when it was like, oh shit, I've definitely crossed the crazy barrier, like, what am I going to do, right? Like, how am I going to deal with, these experiences and stuff like that? And, like, the problem is that there's just, oh my gosh, there's, like, no way, there's no resources or anything to actually deal with that, right? And when I was through that, like, I discovered Felix Guattari, and I was not interested in Anti-Oedipus. I was not interested in his philosophical work. I was interested in the fact that he wrote a screenplay that never got made because he was an artist who wanted to be an artist and he couldn't be an artist, and that sucks. That sucks, man, right? And so, when I learned that he was this radical psychotherapist who worked with schizophrenics most of his life, I was absolutely fascinated. And then I learned about the facility that he worked in. He worked in a real hospital called Borde, right? Now, this hospital was a radical hospital that was doing things differently, but, like, for fuck's sake, you know, in introductory textbooks, they talk about token economies, but they don't talk about Borde. Why? Is it because Borde was kind of communist? It's because Borde was kind of communist, wasn't it? Yeah, okay, I'm just kidding. But it's also because of these translation issues and the lack of communication surrounding, you know, what these guys were doing, right? So, again, I got a little distracted. To get back to this translation, right? So this was published in 1984. And notice that for this particular movement, you know, for the political enfranchisement of, you know, schizophrenics, right? You know, this is how they describe him, you know. Felix Guattari was born in France in 1930. He studied pharmacy and philosophy and has worked with the Clinique de la Borde at, God, I can't pronounce that, since its creation in 1953, and despite differences between them, continued to collaborate with its founder, Dr. Jean Uri. This is really funny because they're probably referencing the fact that Uri is really pissed that he was collaborating with these guys to get his work published. Like, there's quite a bit written on that. It's pretty funny. Just FYI, if you are like a hard-lined psychiatrist, right, part of the reason why we need to research this shit is because there's other people here too, right? It's not just some wacko cuckoo guy who's going around and doing what he wants. He appeals to me because I'm a schizophrenic, basically, right? Like, but, you know, Jean Uri is probably a bit more appealing to somebody who, you know, wants to treat people, because, you know, Jean Uri is a lot less politically involved. He's much more interested in treating the patient, but he was still involved in this movement, right? This institutional psychotherapy movement, right? And that he's talking about with Borde here. And it says, he also studied with Jacques Lacan and became, with him, an analyst member of the Freudian School of Paris in 1969. Then he burned that. He has published, Psychoanalysis and Transversality, Molecular Evolution, and Machinic Unconscious. This volume is made up of chapters taken from the first two. With the philosopher Gilles Deleuze, he published these. Yeah, we all know this. He was one of the founders of the magazine Researches and is a member of the influential Center. I can't pronounce that. Okay, yeah. Oh wait, is this? No, I don't know which one that is actually. He was doing a lot of shit in the 1970s. There's like 10 fucking orgs he was involved with. I don't fucking know which one this is. But anyways, he is an active participant with the alternative movement of psychiatry, along with David Cooper, R.D. Lang, just putting themselves out there, Franco Basaglia, which I don't actually know about, and Guattari does talk quite considerably about. It's one of my research holes that I haven't gotten around to discussing. Robert Castell and others. He now conducts a seminar on theoretical and practical developments in schizoanalysis, which is funny because I think that's what Schizoanalytic Onion is actually translating right now. Anyways, so we can see how this is framed, right? Because, you know, this is David Cooper trying to promote his, you know, in this particular political movement within the UK through, you know, Guattari's work, right? So we can kind of see that there's this whole thing just through analyzing the translation history of this one book. We can see that there's a lot of shit going on here that you're not going to know about if you just read the philosophy books, right? So, you know, I want to look at a couple of things, right? So what a lot of people do is let me take a look at this, page 194, right? Okay. So a lot of people, they will read this book, right? It's called, let me close this. It's called Intersecting Lives by Francois Doss, right? I don't know who translated it. Now, okay, this person translated it. Now, I have a couple problems with this book, right? This book is essentially a biography of Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari. Now, I don't know a ton about the accuracy of the Gilles Deleuze part, right? But I have some issues with how the Felix Guattari narrative is presented here, right? So the page that I had open Give me a second. It was 194. Right. Let me see. Is it here? Okay. So, one thing I have a big problem with is that how Doss presents the clinical work of what they were doing is in sharp contrast to, in my opinion, to like what the actual like work that we know exists, right? So, for example, he says here, Guattari described his first case of schizophrenia at Borde. He would spend as many as 5 hours a day with the patient, who identified with his therapist's favorite writer, Kafka. Guattari had a patient recopy The Castle, and Guattari recorded his readings until he readopted his proper identity. Once cured, the patient left for Israel, hoping to make a real contribution to Israeli-Arab peace. Now, this is actually gathered from two sources, right? Now, the general summary of this is correct. The events that happened are what these historical accounts, have, kind of put together, right? But I'd like to go through those accounts and explain why the way that Doss depicts it is questionable. The big thing I have a problem with is cured. Like, let's take a look for a second what I mean here, right? So first, psychoanalysis and transversality, right? This character was called R.A. That was the name of this anonymized subject. So this whole thing right here is essentially these few pages here, right? These are an account of how they dealt with this particular case, right? And this guy was particularly challenging. And what's really interesting about this case is that he along with Jean Uri worked together to try to figure out a solution, and what they came up with was to record their conversations with a tape recorder, and they would transition to different kind of recording surfaces, right? And what eventually happened was, they used this as a means to allow him to kind of like construct something that he could work with to start to understand himself, right? Like if we look at the end of this piece, we see they say, today the situation is different. He is entirely in his text, and he is the one who put himself there. He has now acquired a kind of symbolic personality, one to which he is attached, and that changes the meaning of his illness, which is no longer experienced through the feeling of his almost magical membership in his family, where, according to him, everyone is sick. He is no longer exactly like his father, the obsession that he was constantly struggling with in vain. In reading his text, it seems that he has gained a much more phenomenological understanding of the essence of his illness, and that this is a good way to help him find ways out of it, right? So when we read that, we can tell he's not cured, okay? He made significant progress to be able to understand himself, to be able to even manage and understand and cope and deal with his illness, but he was not cured. And Guattari does not say he was cured, right? And, I don't feel like pulling it up right now, but Doss's account also kind of doesn't focus on how Uri was involved in this process too, which he makes very clear. Like, with Dr. Uri, we decided that my conversations with R.A. would take in the presence of a tape recorder. So he agreed with Uri and worked with Uri to come to that conclusion. And that's really important. That's really interesting, especially when we're thinking about, like, the production of social assemblages. Like, it wasn't just G, man. It wasn't just him. Let's get real. And then, if we read the Anti-Oedipus papers, where we also see him talking about the same guy here, right? The case of R.A., my first schizo, took up at least 4 to 5 hours a day. It took over everything, including my friends and even my girlfriends. Yeah, he was getting around. Likening them in spite of myself to my favorite author, I made him copy out The Castle. He even got into dressing up quite amazingly like Kafka himself. Magico-mechanic technique of the tape recorder, less common back then. He listened to his own voice, in other words, mirror stage at the level of the voice, deterritorialized mirror stage. It's as if we have reconstituted him little by little in the style of President Schreber's 642. Lacan, fascinated by this endeavor, also ended up vampirizing him. Now he's quote-unquote doing well. He went to Israel hoping to do something for the Arabs. This case, which was very serious at first, wasn't serious at all in retrospect and never had been schizophrenic for illegible that I had to report to. What? Schizophrenia among young people is nothing and everything at the same time. I think that juvenile crises flirt with psychosis. We can't all get worked up about it. Which is honestly kind of funny. Again, we don't know a lot about this case, right? And we do, at least we have this monograph right here to contrast with, right? But it's very clear that Guattari certainly doesn't think that he's cured. And we can kind of see now why we can't just rely on, intersecting lives, even though it has a lot of stuff about, the clinic and things like that. It's somewhat of an unreliable resource when talking about Guattari's work because it kind of makes him out to be this flowery figure that could cure everybody's problems. So, again, imagine yourself that you're this schizophrenic person who, is trying to, figure out what to do with their lives, and you find out about this guy, and you hear that he's a pretty good therapist, and he's writing all this stuff about schizophrenia and stuff, and you kind of want to know what his clinical practice is like, and that's the thing. It's very hard to research because, a lot of that text is just not translated. A lot of that text just, isn't around. Like, the best we really have in English, outside of, some things in psychoanalysis and transversality, such as the monograph here, right? We have some things in Chaosophy where, like, for example, he's talking about, his opinion on, like, how the Borde is run and things like that. And again, like, part of the reason why I'm interested in this history is not just because of Felix Guattari. It's because he was part of a larger movement with a bunch of different ideas. Like, you have people like Jean Oury and Pollack and, other figures. Oh, there's Delaney too, somebody that, and I think it's worth talking about, eventually on my channel about Delaney. He's really hard to research in English, and he's also just very mysterious in general. But, he's pretty cool, and according to Doss's account, again, I don't know exactly what happened, and it appears that it happened in untranslated works. Guattari really pissed him off for a really stupid reason, and, big L on Guattari's part. I'll just say that much on that particular incident. But yeah, so essentially, long story short, there's not a lot published on this clinic stuff, and what's really interesting about it is that, unlike the anti-psychiatry movement, Borde was not only successful but is still in operation today, insofar as I know. Right? Last time I checked, it was technically 2024, but I'm pretty sure it's probably still in operation unless there's been a huge financial crunch or something, right? Actually, let me just, I'm sure I can find it. I'm sure I can find the website. Give me a second. Shit. Where is it? There's got to be the website on here somewhere. Ah, here it is. Gotta love the HTTP classic. All right, so yeah, they still have their website right here. Where was the thing? No, this is the history. So, oh yeah, this is really cool. You can this is talking about Oury, right, and Oury's work, and institutional psychotherapy. And again, if you're not interested in Guattari and his crazy shit, right, and I totally understand that, right, Oury would be definitely somebody to check out. And it's important because, again, all of these people were interested in enfranchising, schizophrenics. The reason why is because this movement emerged as a response to an anti-fascist, it was an anti-fascist response to attempts to literally kill thousands of schizophrenics. Thousands of schizos starved to death During occupied Nazi-occupied France in World War II, because of, essentially directives to starve all of them, right? And they were not given the resources to be able to live. They starved to death, and it's horrific. And like, this whole movement emerged from that, and this hospital is still around, and like nobody talks about it. Like, okay, Guattari was a weirdo, maybe but like nobody talks about the hospital. This is why understanding the clinical context of what Guattari was doing is important, because it's more than just, capitalism and schizophrenia. There were people who were struggling, who had problems that actually existed, that you can read about, and you can learn about. And, like, look at this. Like, this is a real fucking thing. I'm trying to find the thing, because there's something crazy on here I want to show you guys. Where is it? Here. Where is it? Look at this. Look at this. 1350 euros a day. It cost me 10K to go to the fucking mental hospital for 6 days. And in fucking France, you can go to this fucking castle for fucking less than 15 euros a day. That's fucking insane. And people wonder why I fucking hate Anglo-psychiatry. Like, people wonder why I'm so sick of this shit. Like, this is the possibilities that we have, Like, it's not all about being miserable. It's not all about torture porn. It's not all about, everything sucked. Everyone wants to talk about how people were abused in psychiatric hospitals. You read Schreber's account, and there's some really horrifying shit that happens in there. They absolutely, like the way they treated him is unreal. Like, what I'm thinking about specifically is like when they were bathing him and they were dunking him for like long periods of time, and he thought that they were trying to drown him. Like, yeah, I would feel that way too. I think anybody would feel that way under those conditions, right? But people forget that there's a whole part of that book where he's talking about how he should have the right to have his job again. And, yeah, okay, I know some people are going to be like, well, you're schizo, you can't be a judge. But, like, that's important political enfranchisement. That's somebody saying, I have a right to be in a particular position in society. Just because this happened to me doesn't mean my life is over. And you know what? There's not enough discussion in schizophrenic spaces about that. There's not enough, like, it's all hopeless, right? And the most that we can ever achieve is just doing a good job at being like a normal person. And I think there's more to our lives than that, and the reason why I in particular gravitate towards Guattari is because I believe that his extensions outside of psychiatry and outside of his clinical work, in addition to his work as a therapist, like, really made him, significant in this discourse surrounding like the enfranchisement of, schizophrenics. He tried to do some really irresponsible things at the clinic because of his ideas. And I think that's important to talk about. I think that's important to have discourse about. He really pissed off Jean Oury because he tried to get some schizophrenics at the clinic involved in May 1968. And that's extremely irresponsible. Don't fucking do that. But at the same time, right, his line of thinking also made me look at that and say, well, maybe those people weren't the right person for that, but maybe somebody like me, maybe I am. And that is a risk that I consciously take, and that is a risk that, can impact my life negatively. And I think that people who, hear that, and people who see this need to understand that this is not a cure or a treatment. It's a existential relationship between you and your life. What does your life really mean anymore, right? And to me, I found that through what this guy was trying to do, right? And I feel like I'm potentially the right, I'm the right schizo to do it, or one of the right schizos to do it at least. I'm definitely not the only one. And I would really appreciate it if, like, people didn't reduce the discourse surrounding it into, we're just vulnerable idiots who don't know what we're talking about. Because there is actually, there's a lot to discuss here, right? Especially regarding the failures and differences of, anti-psychiatry and alternative psychiatry and things like that. But also there's things to discuss about the successes to, radical psychiatry experiments, such as Borde and institutional psychotherapy. And the thing is that I can't speak on it with, a authoritative, perspective, because there's just not a lot published on it in English, right? I mean, this right here, for example, is really valuable. This is from Chimeras, with review Chimeras, right? And this is a online magazine that I believe Guattari was involved in its earlier years, that transitioned to the internet and has a lot of his texts in French, right? So this is about this is about him talking about how he's structured patient activities at Borde, right? Now, I can't read French well enough to tell everything what this says, but look at all this. This is not in English, right? Now, I'm pretty sure this was referenced in Disalienation by Camille Rapsis, but if you actually want to research it directly yourself, you need to have access to French, right? But look at all this. This is 14 pages of him just talking about how he worked in the clinic. This is such valuable historical information, right? And that's why it kind of ticks me off when people, tried to dismiss, his relationship with psychiatry, because the reality of it is that the discourse surrounding Guattari hasn't gotten to that point yet. A lot of people who are into researching Guattari are not interested in the schizophrenic, and that's a problem. We need to change that.